Remember those clever kitchen tricks every housewife of the 1950s swore by? Back then, they kept suppers hearty, waist low, and families well fed through rationing's long shadow and beyond. What got lost when we stopped passing them down? Rice to keep salt flowing. In damp British kitchens, and let's be honest, most of them were, salt cellars often clumped into stubborn bricks. Instead of fancy gadgets, housewives relied on a thrifty trick. Drop a few grains of uncooked rice into the shaker. The rice absorbed the extra moisture, keeping the salt loose and ready to sprinkle over chips or a nice bit of haddock. Every kitchen had at least one cellar rattling faintly with little white kernels inside, a sound as familiar as the whistle of the kettle on the hob. Some women even taught their daughters that if they heard rice in the shaker, it meant Mum knew her business. Cerebos salt tins sat on every shelf, and housewives made sure they poured properly. Over time, anti-caking agents made the practice less necessary. But the memory of shaking a glass salt cellar and hearing that tiny rattle of rice is one of those small details that instantly transports you back to the 1950s supper table. Mayonnaise in cake batter. Every pantry in the 1950s had a jar of salad cream or mayonnaise. Heinz was the favorite in most homes. And it was not just for ham sandwiches or prawn cocktails. Housewives discovered that mayonnaise could step in for eggs and oil in cake recipes. It sounds odd today, but when you realize mayo is just eggs and oil whisked together, it makes perfect sense. The result was cakes that were moist, rich, and stayed soft for days under a glass dome on the worktop. Recipes like chocolate mayonnaise cake and spice cake popped up in the Women's Institute cookbooks and in magazines such as Woman's Own. They were often described as foolproof because the mayo added just the right amount of fat and binding. Some women swore their cakes turned out better this way, especially in drafty kitchens where desserts tended to dry out quickly. It was also a handy wartime holdover trick. When eggs were still on ration or oil was scarce, mayonnaise filled the gap beautifully. By the time packet mixes improved in the 60s, most families stopped adding mayonnaise. But ask around, and plenty of grandmothers will still insist that a mayo cake is the moistest chocolate cake you will ever taste. It is one of those little secrets that sound strange until you have had a forkful. Chilling bowls for whipped cream. Whipped cream was a prized topping in the 1950s, essential for trifles, fruit salads, and Victoria sponges. But getting it stiff and fluffy without collapsing was tricky in kitchens warmed by the Aga or a range. Women learned this from magazines like Good Housekeeping or directly from their own mothers. When the cream hit that frosty bowl, it thickened quickly and whipped up high, ready to crown a sherry trifle or a slice of chocolate gâteau. The solution was simple. Chill your mixing bowl and beaters in the fridge beforehand. This trick became a kind of ritual. Bowls were placed in the fridge first thing in the morning if you knew visitors were coming for afternoon tea. Double cream was not cheap, so nobody wanted a runny mess after all that whipping. Eventually, aerosol cans of squirty cream made things faster, but old-fashioned whipped cream still had a taste and texture nothing could beat. To this day, a few cooks still chill their bowls, keeping alive a simple trick that made puddings a little more elegant on a 1950s supper table. Newspaper for grease and odors. Before kitchen roll came cheap and plentiful, yesterday's Daily Mirror or Express did double duty in the kitchen. Housewives used it to blot fried fish or bacon, soak up grease from worktops, or even wrap scraps before tossing them in the bin. One especially clever trick was using crumpled newspaper to deodorize. Slip some into shoes, line the fridge shelves, or pack it into lunch tins to keep them fresh. The ink smudged, of course, and no one would dream of it today. But back then, it was simply practical. Housewives who grew up during the war never wasted a thing, and a newspaper was far too handy to throw away unread. You would see wads of it under the sink, ready for the next mess. By the 1970s, plenty and cling film replaced those humble sheets. But the smell of fried fish laid out on yesterday's headlines is a memory etched in many kitchens of the 1950s. The ice cube trick for perfect deviled eggs. Deviled eggs were a staple at church fetes and women's institute luncheons. But peeling hard-boiled eggs could drive a housewife half mad. Shells stuck, whites tore, and presentation was everything when your platter was going on the village hall table. After boiling, women would plunge the eggs into a bowl of ice-cold water, sometimes with ice cubes from their refrigerator metal trays. The rapid chill caused the egg to shrink just slightly inside the shell, making peeling so much easier. You would hear the satisfying crack as the shell slipped off in neat pieces instead of stubborn flakes. Some magazines recommended rolling the cooled egg on the worktop to loosen it further. It was a little step that saved time and spared frustration, especially when you were making a dozen or more for Sunday dinner. Once modern eggs got fresher and plastic trays replaced those clanky metal ice cube molds, the trick became less common. But ask anyone who remembers helping their mother peel eggs for a picnic, and they will tell you the ice cube trick was the difference between a pretty platter and a plate of egg mayonnaise. Storing dripping in jars. Nothing in a 1950s British kitchen went to waste, especially bacon drippings and beef dripping. Housewives carefully poured the hot fat through a strainer into jars, often old Kilner jars or cleaned-out paste pots, and kept them by the cooker or in the larder. That dripping flavored everything: roast potatoes, fried bread, Yorkshire puddings, even spread on toast with a sprinkle of salt. Some women kept a designated dripping jar right beside the salt and pepper, decorated with a proper lid or labeled with a strip of sellotape. It was not just thrift, it was tradition. You could walk into almost any kitchen and see a jar of creamy white dripping sitting proudly, ready to be used. By the 1970s, when health warnings hit the airwaves, many families abandoned the dripping jar. But anyone who grew up in the 1950s knows that real flavor often started with a spoonful of saved fat, kept in a humble jar by a practical housewife who wasted nothing. Vinegar to rescue burnt pans. Every housewife had a favorite saucepan, and sometimes it ended up scorched after porridge or gravy stuck fast to the bottom. Scrubbing with wire wool risked scratching it, so women relied on vinegar. The trick was to pour in a little malt vinegar and water, bring it to a simmer, and let the acid loosen the blackened bits. Magazines like Woman's Weekly ran this tip as a miracle solution, and it really worked. Plus, it left the pan shining like new. Housewives swore by vinegar for dozens of chores, brightening teapots, deodorizing sinks, and even shining windows. Bottles of Sarsens sat on shelves not just as an ingredient for chips, but as a cure-all cleaner, long before green cleaning was trendy. As non-stick cookware and washing up liquid came along, the vinegar trick faded from daily use. But anyone who grew up in the 50s can recall the sharp, tangy smell of vinegar bubbling on the hob as a scorched pan came back to life. Potato water for gravy. Boiling potatoes for supper was routine in the 1950s, and thrifty cooks knew never to waste that cloudy cooking water. It was full of starch, perfect for thickening gravies, soups, and sauces. Instead of pouring it down the drain, they saved a cup or two, using it to stretch meat juices into silky gravy or to enrich a pot of vegetable soup. Some even claimed it gave bread a fluffier rise when used in place of plain water. Housewives learned this from their mothers, many of whom had carried the trick through wartime rationing. By the 1960s, when Bisto granules became popular, fewer women bothered saving potato water. But anyone who grew up in a thrifty kitchen remembers the way it was carefully poured into a jug on the worktop, proof that in the 1950s, every scrap and drop had a second life. String for perfectly sliced cake. Not everyone had a drawer full of gadgets in the 50s, and electric knives were still years away from being common. If you wanted a neat slice of cake without crumbs sticking everywhere, you did not reach for a knife. You grabbed a piece of plain kitchen string. Housewives would hold the string taut and gently pull it down through a cake, creating clean, even slices that looked downright professional. Some women even used dental floss, a thrifty solution pulled right from the bathroom cabinet. This was especially useful for airy sponges or layered Victoria sandwiches straight from a B-row recipe book. It was a small trick, but it meant your cake slices looked like they came from a bakery window instead of a crumb-scattered plate. As serrated knives and shop-bought cakes became the norm, the string method quietly disappeared. But in its day, it was a clever solution passed around neighborhood kitchens, proof that sometimes the simplest tools worked best. Wax paper as a non-stick hero. Long before non-stick tins and baking parchment lined supermarket shelves, greaseproof paper was the unsung hero of the kitchen. Housewives laid it down to keep biscuits from sticking, wrapped sandwiches for packed lunches, and even pressed it over icing to keep cakes smooth while setting. A square of greaseproof between cheese slices in the fridge kept them from sticking together, and children knew it as the wrapper around every jam sandwich packed for school. Women even used it to line biscuit tins and cake boxes. It was cheap, versatile, and always in the drawer. Over time, cling film and silicone baking mats muscled in, but greaseproof paper was the real workhorse of the 1950s kitchen. Today, it mostly lives on for old-fashioned bakers and sweet makers. But in its heyday, it was a housewife's best friend, and one roll lasted months. Bread to keep sugar soft. Every larder had a canister of sugar. In damp British kitchens, it often hardened into stubborn clumps. Housewives discovered that dropping a slice of fresh bread into the jar worked like magic. The bread absorbed the excess moisture, keeping the sugar soft and scoopable for tea, baking, or porridge. Some women swore by apple slices instead, which had the same effect but added a faint sweetness. It was one of those quiet tricks that rarely made it into magazines, but everybody seemed to know. You would open a sugar jar in 1957 and find a half-dry slice of Hovis at the bottom, not for eating, but for saving the sugar. When sealed packets and moisture-proof canisters came along, the bread trick faded into obscurity. If you ever ask a grandmother how to keep demerara from turning into a brick, do not be surprised if she says that you should toss a piece of bread in there, love. It works every time. Tins for freezing leftovers. Before plastic containers and stackable Pyrex, housewives had to get creative with leftovers. Enter the trusty biscuit tin or golden syrup tin. Those sturdy Tate and Lyle and McVitie's tins were far too useful to toss, so women scrubbed them clean and turned them into makeshift freezer containers. Soups, stews, mince, even shepherd's pie filling went straight in. Once frozen solid, the food could be tipped out in a neat block, ready to be reheated in a saucepan or oven dish. It might not have looked elegant, but it was practical, cheap, and space-saving in the small freezer compartments most families had. Some women even labeled each tin with a strip of sticky tape, stacking them like soldiers ready for duty on a busy weeknight. You could walk into a neighbor's kitchen in 1957 and peek in the freezer to find a lineup of tins holding a week's worth of suppers. Over time, Tupperware became the norm, and freezing in metal tins faded away. But there's something charming about the image of a resourceful housewife turning yesterday's syrup tin into tomorrow's stew container. It was recycling before recycling was even a word. Cleaning cast iron with salt. In traditional kitchens, cast iron skillets and griddles were sacred. You did not dare scrub them with soap, because soap was said to ruin the seasoning built up over years. Instead, housewives cleaned their pans with coarse salt, After frying bacon or making drop scones, they would pour in a handful of Saxa salt and use a rag or half a potato to scrub out the grease and bits. The salt scoured without stripping away the precious seasoned layer, leaving the pan ready for the next meal. Women passed this trick down like gospel, and every seasoned cook had her own method. Some swore by wiping with newspaper afterwards, others rubbed in a touch of lard before putting it away. Over time, washing up liquid and non-stick pans replaced this ritual. But cast iron lovers still keep the salt trick alive. For many, it was not just about cleaning. It was about respect for the pan that fed the family day after day. A pinch of salt in the coffee pot. Percolators and stovetop pots were the workhorses of the 1950s kitchen, bubbling away on hobs morning after morning. But they had one problem. Coffee often turned bitter from over-extraction, especially if it sat too long waiting for the family to wake. Housewives had a simple solution: a pinch of salt sprinkled right into the grounds. That tiny bit of seasoning softened the bitterness and smoothed out the flavor, creating a richer, less harsh cup. It was not written in cookbooks so much as passed along by word of mouth, neighbor to neighbor, or from mother to daughter. In some households, it was just understood that if you were making coffee, you added a little salt. Camp Coffee and Nescafe preferred to talk about rich flavor in their adverts, but plenty of women quietly relied on the salt trick to keep breakfast pleasant. As instant coffee took over in the 60s, the custom faded away, but old-timers still swear by it. It is one of those small, nearly invisible habits that tell the story of daily life in the 50s. Ordinary, practical, and forgotten by most, yet powerful in its simplicity. Celery in water to keep it crisp. Celery was the workhorse of kitchens in the 1950s, chopped into stews, stuffed with cream cheese, or fanned out on relish platters for visitors. But limp celery was no good. The trick was simple. Stand the stalks upright in a glass of cold water in the fridge. Housewives discovered this would rehydrate the stalks, turning them crisp and snappy again. Sometimes they would even add a few ice cubes for good measure. This little hack often appeared in the kitchen tips columns of the day, right next to hints for polishing silver. Children remembered the sight of tall jam jars filled with celery in the fridge, ready to be pulled out for after-school snacks. With today's pre-trimmed bags of celery hearts, we do not think much about reviving vegetables. But in the 1950s, making produce last an extra week was a small victory, and a glass of cold water could make celery crunch like it was fresh from the greengrocer. Toothpicks to test cakes. In the 1950s, ovens did not always heat evenly, and timers were not the most reliable. So how did housewives know when a cake was ready? They reached for a wooden cocktail stick or toothpick. A quick poke in the center told the tale. If it came out clean, the cake was done. If crumbs clung, it needed a few more minutes. It was a simple trick passed from mother to daughter, often used while baking from B-Row or McDougall's recipe books. Some women even used clean broom straws before cocktail sticks became cheap and plentiful. It was not glamorous, but it worked, and it saved many a birthday cake from being pulled out half-baked. Today, we rely on fan ovens, digital timers, and recipes with precise bake times. But back then, the toothpick test was the gold standard. For many women, it was not just a baking hack. It was a little ritual, part of the rhythm of homemaking in a decade when every cake on the table meant celebration. Potato slices to rescue soup that is too salty. Stretching food was the name of the game, and nothing was more frustrating than over-salting a pot of soup. Housewives had a clever fix. Drop in a few raw potato slices and let them simmer. The potatoes absorbed the excess salt, mellowing the flavor and saving supper. This trick often came up in advice columns and church cookbooks, passed around like a little piece of kitchen magic. Women swore it saved countless meals, especially when cooking in bulk for family gatherings. After simmering, the potatoes were fished out and discarded, having done their quiet duty. By the 1970s, when stock cubes and tinned soups became more common, the potato trick faded from daily life. But anyone who remembers their mother hovering over a pot of ham and pea soup, dropping in potato slices with a hopeful prayer, knows just how valuable this little hack once was. Storing lettuce with tea towels. In the 1950s, round lettuce and coes reigned supreme, crisp, crunchy, and perfect for salads. It showed up at nearly every supper table when the weather warmed, but keeping it fresh was a challenge before pre-washed bags and plastic boxes. That's where a clever little trick came in. Housewives would wash the leaves, wrap them in slightly damp tea towels, and tuck the bundle into the refrigerator. The cloth soaked up excess moisture, keeping the lettuce crisp for days instead of turning soggy. Before long, this method was passed from neighbor to neighbor, showing up in magazine advice columns and whispered around Women's Institute meetings. Tupperware containers eventually took over, promising freshness forever in pastel colors. But many women kept right on using their tea towel method, especially frugal homemakers who saw no reason to buy expensive gadgets when a clean cloth did the job. Today, we just grab a bag of pre-chopped mixed leaves. But back then, keeping lettuce perky took a little know-how. And for folks who grew up eating crisp wedges drenched in salad cream, that tea towel trick is a fond memory of a time when even salads had to be coaxed into staying fresh. Kilner jars as everyday helpers. Long before Pinterest made them trendy, Kilner jars and mason jars were an everyday tool in kitchens of the 1950s. Housewives used them for everything: bottling fruit, storing leftovers, holding dry goods, and even serving homemade lemonade. A fridge might have jars filled with leftover soup, pickled onions, or homemade custard, each covered with grease-proof paper and a rubber band. Children often drank cold milk straight from a glass bottle at breakfast, without a second thought. These jars were durable, affordable, and endlessly reusable, a perfect match for thrifty homemakers. Nearly every family had boxes of jars tucked in the larder or cellar, ready for the next batch of jam or chutney. Over time, plastic containers pushed them aside. But Kilner jars never truly disappeared. Today they are seen as vintage chic, but in the 1950s, they were simply the most reliable multi-tool in the kitchen. Housewives knew that if you had a shelf of good jars, you had storage, serving, and saving all covered. Hanging bananas to slow ripening. Fresh fruit wasn't as abundant year-round in the 50s. Rationing had only ended in 1954, so keeping it from spoiling was important. Bananas in particular ripened quickly in warm kitchens. The solution? Hang them. Housewives learned that hanging bananas from a hook or a dedicated stand kept them from bruising and slowed the ripening process by letting air circulate. It wasn't uncommon to see a small banana hanger tucked near the bread bin, holding the week's fruit supply. This simple trick appeared in homemaking tips, right alongside advice on keeping celery crisp or ripening green tomatoes on the windowsill. By the time larger supermarkets made bananas cheaper and more plentiful, people worried less about extending their shelf life. But in the 1950s, a housewife's cleverness often meant stretching produce as far as possible. And the sight of bananas swinging gently from a hook was one more reminder of her quiet ingenuity. Flour sack towels for just about everything. Before multi-purpose cloths became a marketing gimmick, housewives knew the humble flour sack towel could do it all. After buying flour in large sacks, they would wash, bleach, and hem the fabric into soft, durable towels. These became dishcloths, straining cloths for jam making, even makeshift aprons. Some women embroidered pretty borders on them, turning simple sacks into kitchen treasures. They dried dishes without lint, polished glass until it sparkled, and were gentle enough for proving bread. Best of all, they were practically free, part of that thrifty use-it-up, wear-it-out mindset every housewife lived by. As packaging changed and flour came in paper bags, the practice faded. You will still spot flour sack towels in country kitchens. For women of the 50s, they were not retro chic or boutique items. They were the everyday fabric of life, transformed by clever hands into something endlessly useful. Using bottles to roll pastry. Not everyone in the 1950s had a wooden rolling pin, but nearly everyone had an empty glass bottle or milk bottle. Resourceful housewives rolled out pie crusts and short crust pastry with milk bottles, sauce bottles, or even smooth jam jars. The glass kept the dough cool, and if you popped the bottle in the fridge first, it worked even better. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done, especially when a last-minute pie was needed for a church fete or a neighbor's visit. Children often watched in awe as Mum rolled dough with a bottle that had been holding HP sauce just the week before. Rolling pins eventually became standard in every kitchen drawer. But the memory of a clever woman turning pantry items into pastry tools is part of what made kitchens of the 1950s so resourceful. A pastry case rolled with a milk bottle may not have been fancy, but it sure tasted like home. Every roast chicken dinner in the 1950s ended with bones simmered into stock. Nothing went to waste. But storing that golden liquid was not always simple. The clever solution was to pour cooled stock into those clunky aluminium ice cube trays with the pull-up handle. Once frozen, the cubes were popped out and saved in bags or jars, ready to drop into gravies, sauces, or soups. It meant you did not have to thaw a whole jug just to flavor a casserole. Children sometimes thought they were sneaking ice cubes, only to find chicken-flavored ice instead. This little trick made perfect sense in a time when freezer space was precious and stock cubes were not yet filling every cupboard. Later, OXO cubes and tinned broth pushed it aside. But for thrifty housewives, an ice cube tray was more than just a place for lemonade cubes. It was a tool for stretching every last drop of flavor. Toothpaste for silver polishing. In the 1950s, every housewife had silver to shine, whether it was grandma's cutlery or a treasured tea set brought out for company. Shop-bought silver polish wasn't always cheap or handy, so many women reached for something already in the bathroom cabinet: plain white toothpaste. A dab on a rag, and a bit of elbow grease would buff away tarnish, leaving spoons and serving pieces gleaming for Sunday tea. The trick passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, often mentioned in homemaking columns alongside vinegar and bicarbonate of soda remedies. The minty smell might have been out of place in the kitchen, but the results spoke for themselves. By the time specialized cleaners and automatic dishwashers became common, toothpaste lost its place as a multi-purpose miracle. But anyone who ever helped their mother polish the good silver before relatives visited knows this trick worked a treat. Damp cloth over salad to keep it fresh. When entertaining, no one wanted wilted lettuce or soggy potato salad sitting out on the buffet table. The trick was to cover the bowl with a damp cloth. Housewives discovered that laying a clean, moistened tea towel across a salad kept it cool, crisp, and appetizing until mealtime. It was a lifesaver for church fetes and garden parties before cling film existed. This little hack was often listed in community cookbooks and homemaking guides alongside tips for arranging flowers or setting a proper table. Women even embroidered their cloths so they looked presentable draped across a dish at a village fete. But for homemakers of the 1950s, a damp cloth over a salad wasn't just a trick. It was presentation with purpose. Shaking cream in a jar to make butter. Every child in the 1950s probably remembers shaking a jar of cream until their arms ached, waiting for it to turn into butter. It wasn't just a farmhouse trick. Suburban housewives sometimes did it too, especially when cream was plentiful, or as a fun way to involve the children. Add a pinch of salt, and you had fresh butter to spread on scones or bread rolls that very tea time. Articles in magazines occasionally suggested it as a back-to-basics project, and home economics teachers used it to demonstrate how food transformed. It was messy, it was time-consuming, and by the late 1950s, most families simply bought Anchor or Lurpak. Still, the memory of sitting at the table, passing a jar of cream around until it sloshed less and lumped more, is the kind of nostalgic moment that connects people instantly back to childhood kitchens. Waxing cheese to make it last. Refrigeration became common by the 50s, but fridges were small, and not every kitchen had room for endless perishables. To keep cheese from drying out or going moldy too quickly, some housewives dipped blocks of cheddar or Lancashire in melted paraffin wax. This old-time preservation trick, borrowed from farm wives, kept cheese fresh for weeks. You would spot wax-sealed wedges lined up in the larder, a flash of red or yellow color against the shelves. It was not just practical, it was thrifty, since wasting cheese was unthinkable. Later, companies sold pre-waxed cheese products, and eventually cling film and vacuum packaging made home waxing unnecessary. Still, for resourceful homemakers in the 50s, waxing cheese was one more way to stretch the groceries. The memory of peeling away that shiny coating is one of those tactile little details that instantly takes you back. Hanging tea towels in the sun. Washing machines were improving, but kitchens were still damp, and tea towels could sour quickly if left wet. The solution was simple. Housewives pinned them to the washing line outside, letting sunlight and fresh air work their magic. The sun bleached out stains and left the cloth smelling crisp and clean, no fancy detergent needed. Neighbors would often see a row of tea towels fluttering beside bed sheets, part of the daily rhythm of homemaking. Housewives took pride in having fresh linens, and a sour dish rag was considered a real embarrassment. By the 1960s, tumble dryers and synthetic cloths reduced the problem. But for anyone who grew up in that era, the image of a sunny afternoon and bright white tea towels swaying in the breeze is as vivid a kitchen memory as the meals those cloths helped prepare. Keeping brown sugar soft with marshmallows. Brown sugar was a staple in the 1950s kitchen, used for biscuits, baked beans, and sticky toffee puddings. But without airtight containers, it hardened into stubborn lumps. Housewives came up with a sweet little trick. Drop 1 or 2 marshmallows into the canister. The marshmallow's moisture kept the sugar soft and scoopable. Children often thought it was a treat to find sweets hiding in the sugar jar, but it had a practical purpose. Some women preferred slices of apple or bread, but marshmallows were neat, inexpensive, and always on hand thanks to jelly molds and Rice Krispie cakes. This trick was passed down like folklore, appearing in community cookbooks and homemaking columns. By the time resealable bags and plastic tubs arrived, the marshmallow method was not as necessary. But for many homemakers in the 50s, it was one more way of keeping the kitchen running smoothly, with a touch of cleverness and a touch of sweetness. Buttered mince in the oven. Back in the 1950s, not every family had a shiny grill in the garden, and frying mince or rissoles on the hob could leave a greasy mess. So many housewives turned to their trusty ovens. The trick was simple but clever. Shape the rissoles or patties, line them up on a baking tray, and set a knob of butter right on top of each one. As they baked, the butter slowly melted down, basting the meat and keeping it juicy. The smell of sizzling beef and browning butter filled the whole house, and you can bet children were running to the kitchen to ask when tea would be ready. Some women added their own little twists, slipping a slice of onion under the patty, or stirring a packet of soup mix into the mince, which was a real modern shortcut back then. This was not just about taste, It was about efficiency. With rissoles baking hands-off in the oven, a housewife could mash potatoes, prepare a jelly mold, or even fold a load of washing before supper. Once fish and chip shops multiplied and frozen ready meals became the rage, the buttered mince trick quietly slipped into the past. But anyone who grew up in that era can still remember the rich smell of butter basting those oven-baked rissoles. Simple, thrifty, and downright delicious. There you have it. The kitchens of the 1950s may not have had microwaves, slow cookers, or even reliable timers, but they had something better. Women who knew how to make do, stretch the housekeeping money, and keep a household humming. From buttered mince to biscuit tin leftovers, these tricks were not just about saving time. They were about saving supper and saving face when visitors came knocking. Many of these little hacks faded when convenience foods and modern gadgets took over, but they remind us of a time when resourcefulness was a badge of honor. I'd love to hear from you. What clever kitchen tricks do you remember from your mother's or grandmother's kitchen? Did she have her own special way of stretching food, keeping things fresh, or saving a meal? Share your memories down in the comments, because those little stories are part of what keeps our history alive.